Hello, my name is Matthew Brown. I'm here today to talk to you about racial diversity in the suburbs. I've lived in the village of Fairport for the past 15 years. At that same time, I've worked as a family doctor at St. Mary's on Genesee Street in the city. Every day, I drive from my village into Rochester, traveling from a place that is majority white to a neighborhood that is majority people of color. So by way of actual numbers, the village of Fairport is approximately 95% white, 2% black, and 3% other. The town of Perinton is 93% white and 2% African American. This compared to the city of Rochester, which is 47% white, 40% African American, and 18% Latinx. Now there's going to be some overlap there. It's only really in the past year or so that I've started to wonder why exactly this stark discrepancy exists. Now, I've had a lot of conversations about race over these past few months. And when I've asked residents of Fairport why there's such a striking lack of racial diversity here, the answer is invariably, I don't know, everyone's welcome here. And while it may be something that many of us think is true, many of us hope is true, the history of Fairport and the rest of Rochester's suburbs show that the present racial landscape of Rochester and its surrounding communities have been socially engineered from their beginnings. Whether we realize it or not, our suburbs were designed to be places where white people were welcomed and people of color were not. The effects of these intentional acts have been far-reaching and continue to be a major influence on who is able to live in Fairport, in Perinton, and in all of our suburbs. Now, the exclusion of people of color from our community can be divided into two different categories: prevention and discouragement. So, start with prevention. In early parts of the 20th century, when what has come to be known as the Great Migration brought large numbers of people of African descent into our community from the southern states, Rochester and many other communities took steps to limit where these newcomers would be allowed to live. Firstly, real estate agents would refuse to show homes to people of color outside of certain neighborhoods, and had an explicit rule they would not show homes to someone who would devalue the surrounding properties through their ethnicity. Until 1956, their code read, and I'm quoting, "A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing to a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood." Realtors who would not follow this code were kicked out of the industry. In newly built developments, including our town, restrictive covenants were added to the deeds of houses. So what these are provisions placed into the deeds stating that these homes can never be sold or rented to or occupied by a person of color, sometimes with legal repercussions. Now I say are and not were, because although they are now legally unenforceable, these covenants remain on many deeds and may be viewed at the county clerk's office. One local example is the Forest Hills neighborhood in Perinton and East Rochester, whose deeds state no black people and also no Italian or Polish people. And that no Italian or Polish people is unless you were third generation American and thus considered American enough. In 1934, the National Housing Act put about $119 billion in subsidies into the housing market, created the Federal Housing Administration, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also stated that if you were going to create a housing tract and expected to get federal funds for it, you were required to have racially restrictive covenants in order to keep the races separated. And this is because integration was felt, without any supportive evidence, to be a major cause of instability and reduction in property values. Now, in terms of discouragement, talk about FHA and VHA loans. So starting in the 1930s, the federal government offered these FHA and VHA loans, which were 30-year mortgages to allow for home ownership. These were federally qualified, very low interest, and in some cases, no money down loans. And now these were open to white people, but not people of color. And the VA loans, even those people of color who had served in World War II and Korea, were not eligible. For millions of white Americans, including both sets of my own grandparents, these loans were the reason they could afford to purchase their first homes. Now, purchasing a home, as opposed to renting, meant that they could begin to build up wealth within those homes. And they could then use those homes as equity and collateral with which to get loans to start businesses, to send their children to college, to fix their car when it broke down, or to help stave off destitution when other emergencies popped up. If your money had instead gone to a landlord every month rather than into your home, you had no such safety net. And because every American was paying taxes, but only some were benefiting from this widespread program, this represented a huge transfer of wealth from the pockets of people of color to those of white people. Now, zoning laws and codes. Now, the transfer of wealth well begun. In the 1960s, towns and villages began the systematic process of preventing poorer people, which by this time was a huge amount of people of color, preventing them from accessing the suburbs. This was accomplished through changes to the zoning codes, which, in case you were unaware, are a municipality's rules about what gets built where and what doesn't get built at all. Through codes which outlawed or limited apartment buildings and in-law apartments, those who could not afford to purchase homes were effectively disallowed from moving to the suburbs. By outlawing multifamily homes and by raising the minimum lot size on which homes could be built, the baseline cost of a home was inflated to the point where only middle-class families could purchase one in the suburbs. And those people of color who could surpass all the above limitations, they often faced harassment, the likes of which would turn your stomach. Threatening notes, rocks through windows. Though we like to think of New York as being different from the Deep South, for years, tens of thousands of KKK members would meet in East Rochester for their annual gathering. If you were a person of color who could afford to move to the suburbs, would you risk your own safety or that of your spouse or your children? So that's a summary of how we got to where we are today. Rochester and its suburbs, like most of our nation, has a long history of systemic and purposeful racial segregation, rules tilted to benefit white people and keep people of color separated and impoverished. Now, if you stay with me through the first 5 minutes here, then there might be a possibility that you're motivated to do something to change this racial housing inequity in Fairport or Perinton or whatever suburb you might call home. Now, I should note, I am an elected official, so I'm coming from a governmental perspective in terms of what we can do. And I should preface my asks by saying we can't legally create housing specifically for people of any one race or exclude any one race. What we can do is realize that given Monroe County's racial distribution of incomes, where people of color are so much more likely to be living in poverty, if you want to have racial diversity, you have to have economic diversity. And there are a ton of things that we can do to encourage economic diversity in our communities. With anything I ask of people, I like to think in terms of difficulty and time commitment. Basically, 3 levels that I call modified, JV, and varsity level actions. So, introduction. If you haven't heard, both Fairport and Perinton have started the process of updating their comprehensive plans. These are a rather large undertaking and at their core involve developing a plan for what we want our communities to look like over the next 5 to 10 years. Once this vision is developed, we adapt our code and our municipal strategies to achieve it. Part of the comp plan update is reaching out to every citizen of the village and town to solicit their input, likely through an online or mailed survey. Your modified level actions would be to 1, reach out to your elected officials and ask or demand that a statement be included in the comprehensive plan, which would prioritize racial diversity within our communities. And then to make sure when your comprehensive plan survey arrives, that you both include this statement and realize that your answers to questions on the subjects of not just low-income housing or apartments, but multifamily housing, minimum lot sizes, and in-law apartments will also have direct effects on our economic and racial diversity. So plan your answers accordingly. Oh. Yeah, it's modified level. So your JV level assignment, should you choose to accept it, is as follows. Take what you've learned in this short talk and expand on it. I'll include links to a recent talk given by Shane Wigan on redlining in Monroe County, to a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and to a paper written by Professor Reynolds from Yale Law about restrictive zoning used to exclude people of color from Professor Reynolds' hometown, Penfield, New York. Learn enough about these subjects that you're comfortable introducing them into conversations and educate your friends and neighbors. People who live in the suburbs think that suburbs just happened this way. Allowing this pervasive belief to continue is a handy way of ignoring our own complicity in the continued exclusion of people of color from Fairport and Perinton. We should all know how we got here, and you can be the teachers who bring more people in understanding. Your varsity level assignment. Support, join, or create a community land trust. Community land trusts, or CLTs, establish long-term affordable housing and enable residents with low to moderate incomes to become homeowners. One local CLT is City Roots Land Trust, and their website gives a pretty good explanation of what one is all about and what one does. I'll include this in the links as well. Last year, when Pittsford's town board was faced with a proposal by which to improve their racial and economic diversity, Town Supervisor Bill Smith justified his opposition by stating that he didn't believe that diversity should be socially engineered. To me, this blatantly ignores the fact that it is our segregation that was engineered in the first place. To expect it to resolve on its own is naive at best, and at worst will be directly responsible for the continued unconscionable disparities in the lives of the people of Rochester and Monroe County. I can't change this on my own, but with your help, with the help of your neighbors and their neighbors, with enough of us standing up and saying this is important and this needs to be changed, this will be changed. We can craft a more perfect Perinton. We can build a fairer Fairport. If you have questions or want to get more involved, my contact information will also be in the links provided. Thank you.